This is a homily for the 5th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 6, verses 1 to 8. The second reading is from St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verses 1 to 11. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. In the Church's liturgical calendar, we are currently in the period of Ordinary Time that bridges the Christmas season and the beginning of Lent. In today's Gospel, we rejoin Jesus at the beginning of his Galilean ministry. Keep in mind that the Sunday lectionary chooses the first reading from the Old Testament to complement the theme of the Gospel. Today's Gospel and the first reading from the prophet Isaiah are both about God's call. So let's begin by looking at today's first reading. With its 66 chapters, the book of Isaiah is one of the longest books in the entire Bible. Most scripture scholars agree that the prophecy of Isaiah is in fact the work of 3 different authors. The 3 sections of Isaiah are known as First Isaiah, which includes chapters 1 to 39. That is followed by Second or Deutero-Isaiah, which includes chapters 40 to 55. And then we have Third or Trito-Isaiah, which includes chapters 56 to 66. This division of the book of Isaiah into 3 sections assumes that an 8th century prophet living in Jerusalem could not have known specific details about historical events 2 centuries later, in the 6th century BC, such as the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 586 BC. That is repeatedly mentioned in Isaiah chapters 40 to 55. Nor would he have known about the rise to power of the Persian king Cyrus the Great in 559 BC, which is mentioned in chapters 44 and 45, and his defeat of Babylon in 539 BC, which is mentioned in chapters 47 and 48. Could the prophet, under divine inspiration, have known in detail about these events in the distant future? Well, yes, that is possible. But if Isaiah were to prophesy about the rise of a king in Persia who will conquer Babylon, it would have made little or no sense to an 8th century Judean audience. Such an audience knew nothing about Persia, and Babylon was no threat at all to Judea in the 8th century BC. First Isaiah is set in the 8th century BC between 740 and 710 BC. Second Isaiah is set about 2 centuries later during the Babylonian exile. Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians in 586 BC, and Cyrus, king of Persia, defeats Babylon in 539 BC. Third Isaiah is set in the land of Israel shortly after the end of the exile, so late in the 6th century after the rebuilding of the temple in 515 BC. Today's first reading comes from First Isaiah. It is set in the year of King Uzziah's death. Uzziah was king of Judah, the southern kingdom, and he ruled from 785 to 733 BC. So, it is the year 733 BC. Isaiah tells us of a vision that he received. In this vision, he describes himself as present for a meeting of the divine council. That meeting occurs in the temple, which was the earthly manifestation of the divine court. He sees the Lord seated on a high throne, and above him stood seraphs, each one with 6 wings. They cried out to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. His glory fills the whole earth." We, of course, know these angelic words as the Sanctus, and we sing or recite them each time we gather to celebrate the Eucharist. Having experienced such a breathtaking vision, Isaiah responds, "What a wretched state I am in! I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have looked at the King, the Lord of hosts." However, this confession of unworthiness is no barrier for Israel's God. One of the seraphs then flies to Isaiah, holding in his hand a live coal which he had taken from the altar of incense. He touches the prophet's mouth with the live coal and says, "See now, this has touched your lips. Your sin is taken away. Your iniquity is purged." In the Tridentine Mass, the prayer the priest said prior to reciting the Gospel was, "Cleanse my heart and my lips, O Almighty God, who cleansed the lips of the prophet Isaiah with a burning coal. In your gracious mercy, deign so to purify me, that I may worthily proclaim your holy gospel." Having purified Isaiah's mouth and lips through the action of the seraph, the Lord then addresses the divine council, asking, "Whom shall I send? Who will be our messenger?" Unlike Moses and Jeremiah, Isaiah is not a reluctant prophet. He volunteers to be God's emissary. "Here I am. Send me." Quite coincidentally, today's second reading from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians also reflects a similar theme of God's call and our unworthiness. Paul says that he is the least of the apostles. Since he persecuted the Church of God, he says that he hardly deserves the name of apostle. But by God's grace, that is what I am. Let's now turn to today's Gospel. In the preceding episodes of the Galilean ministry, Jesus appears alone. Jesus now calls his first disciples. Luke tells us that Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret. Here you can see the lake of Gennesaret. The river Jordan flows southwards from the lake of Gennesaret. It flows into the Dead Sea. Jerusalem is located about 34 kilometres to the west of the Dead Sea. So the setting of today's Gospel is the shore of what Luke calls the Lake of Gennesaret, Limne Gennesaret in the Greek. The Hebrew name of the lake is Kinneret. The name that Luke uses, Limne Gennesaret, is the Greek pronunciation of the Hebrew name Kinneret. The lake is also known as Lake Tiberias, taking that name from the city of Tiberias. The city of Tiberias was founded on the west coast of the lake in 20 AD by Herod Antipas, Tetrarch of Galilee, as a new capital to replace Sepphoris. Antipas named the city in honour of the Roman Emperor Tiberius. But perhaps most of us are more familiar with the name Sea of Galilee. As you can see from this satellite photograph, it is not a sea. It is a large freshwater lake with a circumference of 53 kilometres and an area of 166 square kilometres. Its maximum depth is 43 metres. It is between 209 and 215 metres below sea level, making it the lowest freshwater lake in the world, and the second lowest lake in the world, after the Dead Sea, a salt lake. The lake is 12 kilometres at its widest and about 21 kilometres from north to south. A thriving fishing industry flourished on the lake. Fish was one of the staples of the first-century diet in Palestine, and more fish was eaten than any other meat. Jesus catches sight of 2 boats at the water's edge. After fishing all night and catching nothing, the fishermen had got out of their boats and were cleaning their nets. This small detail indicates that the men had finished their long night's work. We know that Simon lived at Capernaum, so this scene would almost certainly be set on the shore of the lake close to Capernaum. Jesus gets into one of the boats, it was Simon's, and asks him to put out a little from the shore. He then teaches the crowds from the boat. New Testament scholar Brendan Byrne offers this interesting observation. At the time Luke wrote his Gospel, a boat had become a symbol for the church. So from early on in this scene we are being given signals that Jesus is about to lay the foundations for the community that will extend his mission and carry it to the ends of the earth. When Jesus had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and pay out your nets for a catch." In Latin, the words "put out into the deep" are duc in altum. At the beginning of this 3rd millennium, Pope John Paul II issued an apostolic letter entitled, in Latin, Novo Millennio Ineunte. That title translates as, "At the beginning of the new millennium." The Pope wrote this letter to outline the priorities for the Church in the 3rd millennium and beyond. One of those priorities is what Pope John Paul II called the new evangelization. The Pope began his letter with the scene from today's Gospel, Jesus telling Simon to put out into the deep, duc in altum. These words ring out for us today, and they invite us to remember the past with gratitude, to live the present with enthusiasm, and to look forward to the future with confidence. The Pope then quotes these words from chapter 13 of the letter to the Hebrews. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. The new evangelization is not a matter of inventing a new program. Pope John Paul reminds us the program already exists. It is the plan found in the Gospel and in the living tradition. It is the same as ever. We must rekindle in ourselves the impetus of the beginnings and allow ourselves to be filled with the ardour of the apostolic preaching which followed Pentecost. We must revive in ourselves the burning conviction of Paul, who cried out, "Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel." The new evangelization therefore acknowledges that routine, mediocrity, and inertia have a deadening effect. Let us look back to the ardour of former days, to the power of Pentecost. Let us again launch out into the deep, placing our hope in the Lord, who is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. In Primal Leadership, a book about leadership and the power of emotional intelligence, the authors highlight one significant pitfall for anyone called to leadership, and they offer a rather unusual experiment to illustrate the point. By the way, I don't recommend trying this experiment, but the authors tell us that if you drop a frog into boiling water, it will instinctively jump out. But if you place a frog in a pot of cold water and gradually increase the temperature, the frog won't notice that the water's getting hotter. It will sit there until the water boils, and the frog will boil with it. The point the authors are making is this: the fate of that poached frog isn't so unlike that of some leaders who settle into a deadening routine. They allow inertia to set in. It's something that happens gradually, and perhaps they're even unaware that it's happening. The same is true in our life as disciples of Jesus. Let me come back to the words of Pope John Paul. We must rekindle in ourselves the impetus of the beginnings and allow ourselves to be filled with the ardour of the apostolic preaching which followed Pentecost. We must revive in ourselves the burning conviction of Paul, who cried out, "Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel." So routine, mediocrity and inertia have a deadening effect. Let us look back to the ardour of former days, to the power of Pentecost. Let us therefore launch out into the deep, placing our hope in the Lord, who is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Let me approach today's gospel from a slightly different perspective. I've spoken before about Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Reflecting on the great stories of humanity from different cultures and from different periods of time, Campbell has noticed that a perennial theme of our storytelling is the journey of the hero. And we're interested in the hero's journey because it is essentially our own journey writ large. The journey begins with what Campbell calls the call to adventure. He offers this explanation. The stage of the mythological journey, which we have designated the call to adventure, signifies that destiny has summoned the hero and transferred his spiritual centre of gravity from within the pale of his society to a zone unknown. In other words, it is a journey into terra incognita, unknown territory. It is launching out into the deep. This is what we have in today's gospel. Jesus tells Simon to put out into deep water and pay out the nets for a catch. It's at this point that we encounter what Campbell calls the guardian of the threshold. The guardian is like a bouncer at a place like a nightclub, someone who stops undesirables from entering. So the guardian represents all of those voices from within, but also voices from other people that try to persuade us to abandon the call to adventure. So what might the guardian of the threshold have whispered in Simon's ear? Maybe it was something like this. "Your family has been fishing these waters for generations. You know the lake like the back of your hand. Who does this carpenter from Nazareth think he is, telling you how to fish?" Or perhaps, You've been fishing all night and caught nothing. If the fish weren't there during the night, they certainly won't be here in the bright daylight. You're absolutely exhausted. It's time to go home, have breakfast and rest. But Simon brushes aside the guardian of the threshold and, as we heard in the Gospel, he nets a huge catch of fish. We have moved from a scene in which Simon has laboured all night and caught nothing to the scene of an abundant catch. The miraculous catch of fish bears a strong resemblance to a similar story found in John's Gospel, chapter 21, verses 1 to 11. In John's Gospel, the disciples returned to Galilee following the death of Jesus. Peter and some of the other disciples go fishing at night on the lake, but they catch nothing. When it was getting light, a stranger standing on the shore tells them to throw out their net to starboard, and they will find something. So they threw out the net, but they did not have enough strength to haul it in because of the number of fish. John's Gospel makes much of the symbolism of darkness and light. At night, in the darkness, the disciples catch nothing. When it is light, the disciples have an abundant catch. This same theme may also be subtly present in Luke's account of the abundant catch of fish. But rather than using the symbolism of darkness and light, Luke uses the theme of the great reversal. The great reversal refers to the contrast between human powerlessness and divine fulfillment. This is a note that Luke sounds in the infancy narrative. The angel Gabriel appears to Mary and tells her not to be afraid. She has found favour with God. She will conceive and bear a son, whom she shall name Jesus. But Mary replies, "But how can this come about, since I have no knowledge of man?" She is then told that the Holy Spirit will come upon her. She is also told that her relative Elizabeth, who was said to be barren, has conceived a son. For nothing is impossible to God. We see this divine reversal again in today's Gospel. Fishing all night, the disciples catch nothing. In obedience to the word of the Lord, they let out their nets and have an abundant catch. But see what happens next. Simon Peter falls to his knees and says to Jesus, "Leave me, Lord, I am a sinful man." Notice a common theme running through today's 3 readings, and that is the sense of sinfulness and unworthiness. Simon Peter says, "Leave me, Lord, I am a sinful man." The prophet Isaiah says, "What a wretched state I am in! I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have looked at the King, the Lord of hosts." And likewise Paul says, "I am the least of the apostles. In fact, since I persecuted the church of God, I hardly deserve the name of apostle." In his book, The Idea of the Holy, the great German scholar of comparative religion, Rudolf Otto, concluded that most individuals have an irreducibly non-rational experience of the numinous, that is, an experience of the interior presence of the transcendent or divine. According to Otto, our emotional response to this mysterious encounter has 2 distinct poles. He writes of the mysterium tremendum et fascinans. On the one hand, it is mysterium tremendum. In other words, we experience a sense of something mysterious, overwhelming, and daunting. We experience dread and awe. We become aware of our sinfulness and unworthiness. We are but tiny creatures. But it is also an experience of mysterium fascinans. We experience a sense of something fascinating, desirable, good, caring, and comforting that invites us into its fullness. It fulfills us, and in so doing produces a unique kind of spiritual joy or bliss. This mysterium tremendum et fascinans is one way of describing Simon's experience of encountering Jesus. But it is just at this moment of Simon's painful self-knowledge and truth that the commission comes. The call described today is more than a summons to faith. It is a call to ministry. Do not be afraid. From now on, it is people you will be catching. In both the Annunciation story and in today's Gospel, we have the words, "Do not be afraid." And then Mary and Simon are entrusted with their mission. In Mary's case, to be the mother of the Son of God. And Simon is to become a fisher of people. In the words of Martin Buber, all revelation is a summons and a sending. Today's three readings remind us that God does not summon and send us because we are perfect. He chooses us in spite of our sinfulness and unworthiness. Consider this example. You are to choose a leader from among 3 candidates. Let me give you a few facts about each candidate and then ask you to make your choice. Candidate A. He associated with crooked politicians, consulted astrologers, had 2 mistresses, was severely disabled, and was a chain smoker. He drank 8 to 10 martinis a day. We're talking about Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States from 1933 until his death in 1945. Candidate B was kicked out of office twice, slept until noon, used opium at university, was an undiagnosed manic depressive, and drank a bottle of whiskey every day. We're talking about Winston Churchill, British Prime Minister between 1940 and 1945 and 1951 until 1955. Candidate C is a decorated war hero, a vegetarian, doesn't smoke or drink except for an occasional beer, has never had an extramarital affair. Now this sounds like a person who would be an ideal leader. His name is Adolf Hitler. In today's Gospel, we have the story of Jesus calling the first disciples who were fishermen. He calls them to leave behind their boats and fishing nets and join him in catching not fish, but people. Eventually there would be 12 members of this inner band of disciples that we know today as the Apostles. We know very little about most of the 12, and much of what we do know isn't impressive. When Jesus is arrested in the garden, what do? According to Mark's Gospel, they all flee for their lives. Peter, you may recall, followed at a distance, And while Jesus is being interrogated, he waits in the courtyard outside, warming himself by a fire. On 3 occasions he is identified by people standing by. "You're one of that man's disciples." And on 3 occasions Peter denies even knowing Jesus. When Jesus dies, he is crucified between 2 thieves. The disciples were nowhere to be seen. When Jesus was arrested, they didn't say, "If you take him, you'll have to take us as well." Had that been the case, there may have been another 12 crosses on Calvary on Good Friday. But there weren't. And strangely, that gives me a sense of hope. The first disciples of Jesus were far from perfect. They were afraid and fearful, just as I am. They were sinners, as I am. In light of today's gospel, we can make 4 observations about discipleship. Firstly, Simon and his companions had done nothing to warrant or merit Jesus' call. It certainly wasn't because they were perfect. They were sinful and fragile human beings like all of us. But Jesus chose them despite their fragility and sinfulness. Secondly, the call to discipleship did not come in a holy place, such as the temple or in a synagogue. Jesus' call came as they were going about their daily work. In other words, the call so often comes amidst the ordinariness of life. Thirdly, the metaphor of fishing reminds us that Jesus' call is more than a summons to faith. It is a call to ministry. The fishermen are called in order to gather others to Jesus. So it is with us. Our call is not merely to a life of personal holiness lived in union with God. Important as that is, we are also called by God to be sent out into the world. Fourthly, in Matthew and Mark's account of the call, we're told that Peter and Andrew and James and John left their father and followed Jesus. In Luke's account of the call of the disciples, we're told that they left everything and followed him. In other words, the call of the kingdom requires a reversal of priorities and a reordering of commitments. These words of Jesus in today's gospel, put out into deep water, are addressed to us as well. Let us therefore make our own the response of the prophet Isaiah. "Here I am, send me."